Hi again then guys, and welcome to a review for a specific car, of course within the world of Forza 7, and it is another DLC car, but this isn't a fully up-to-date one. Typically when a new pack comes out, I'll pick one or two of the most significant cars from it, be it the Roush Mustang recently, something like the Lotus Elise GT1 a little while back. This one though is from a couple of packs ago, but it's still a car that definitely is worthy of talking about and reviewing because it sits within a category of racing which doesn't tend to get that much love in many racing franchises or many specific racing games. Not just this car, but the whole concept of 70s and earlier 80s prototypes. It's not really a category that's looked into that much. Certainly not as much as it deserves to, even though there are specific cars from those eras and those decades that superfans do love, stuff like the Porsche 917s, your Alpine models, for instance, the A442, I believe, from around 78, something like that. So there are those fans, there are those cars that stand out, but most of the love for prototypes, be it Group C, various others as well, once you get up into the 90s, for instance, most of them tend to be from the late 80s onwards when it comes to prototypes. There are far more legendary cars, really, as far as the wider gaming audience goes. Your XJR-9s, your Sauber C9s, once you get into the 90s, the Mazda 787Bs, Peugeot 905s, whereas something like this, from say 1985 or earlier, it's easy to overlook it, especially when the company that it's from, Jaguar, has such a strong line of prototypes. The XJR-5, of course, was overtaken, in effect, by the XJR-9, the XJR-11, XJR-15 even, which is kind of like a Le Mans car for the road in some senses. So it's easy to forget sometimes these older roots of what made those later cars so great. Now, to show my hand a little bit, when it comes to the XJR-5, there are certain things about this car which I love. There are other things, though, which I don't necessarily dislike. They're just things that have to be noted. Things in which it's not quite as strong, areas that it's not as strong, some disadvantages, you could say. So to start off with those disadvantages, to get them out of the way, the main one is that racing tech waits for no one. It advances so quickly, and prototype technology, say endurance prototypes, Group C, LMP, whatever the case may be, they don't advance necessarily quite as quickly as F1 does. That's pretty much the pinnacle. Year to year makes a huge difference, whereas with the Le Mans, it tends to be every few years that the cars become significantly better again, whereas from year to year, some of the cars, for instance, do tend to be carried over with some minor updates, if at all possible, because the essential concept will often still be good enough to race. Whereas with this car, because it's so old now, there are some cars that are of their time, and there are some cars that are out of time. Now, something, for instance, in the Can-Am era, those cars are almost out of time, because they're so groundbreakingly wacky, almost like literal wacky racers. Cars that almost have no rules, insane power, ultra low weight, ridiculous aerodynamic methods like the Chaparral 2J, various McLarens, the hyper powerful Porsche 917 with around 1500 horsepower. Those cars almost feel like they're 30 or 40 years ahead of their time, and they can actually take on a lot of cars which are decades newer and still rival them. Whereas there are others which are very much of their time. And I would say that, kind of unfortunately for the XJR-5, it's definitely one of those. It's not a bad car. It does not feel slow by any stretch. It could easily take on, say, a GT1 car, or a modern GTE, say a GTLM, that kind of machine. But against modern prototypes, or against Group Cs, well, that's where it's going to struggle. Once you get to the late 80s and onwards, where those real legends come in, that's where this car struggles. Now, in its stock form, stock being a relative term, of course, for a race car, it's not that impressive. It's got 525 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot for a Le Mans car or a prototype of any kind, and it's got 430 pound-feet of torque. Now, that's from, if I recall correctly, I believe it's a naturally aspirated unit, a V12, which isn't uncommon for a Jaguar, of course. The XJR-9, which won Le Mans, had a big capacity V12 as well. It worked out really well. That's 7 litre. This one certainly feels like it has the underpinnings of what would become a car like that, but you can definitely feel its age. Now, in particular, the biggest difference that you can feel when even a beginner level driver drives an older prototype compared to a newer one, and this applies to F1 as well. In fact, it applies to a lot of racing forms, but especially the pinnacles, which are prototypes and formula cars, and that is that the difference in aero technology really stands out. You can feel it very quickly. Now, you might not know that you're feeling it. You might think that the car just feels slippery and not really know why it feels like that. Maybe, for instance, if you're not as familiar with cars or with racing tech, but you will still notice the difference. You take this car through a corner at a certain speed, say 100 miles per hour, and it feels considerably different to taking an early 90s prototype through that same corner at that same speed, or then again, say a 2013 LMP1 through that same corner. Because aero technology in particular, along with a variety of other things of course, they advance so much. Different categories, different decades, different years even, the cars do become significantly better, as of course you'd hope they would. Now, in the case of this car, it feels its age, it has to be said. It's lightweight, for sure. It weighs 921 kilos, which certainly isn't bad. The horsepower per tonne is 570. The category is P941, so it's not ridiculously high. And even the price tag of 650 grand actually wouldn't be that bad. You don't have to buy it anyway because it's in the pack, but even if you did, it's a great collector's piece. It's an old school prototype, and it gives you this great vibe, almost like those 1930s Grand Prix cars, of where kind of the origins of this particular sport were. This isn't the earliest of prototypes, but it certainly feels like a really original prototype. Even the look of the car, it has that bare bones birth of the Group C shape kind of vibe to it, where it doesn't have wings or intakes all over the place, it's just the bare bones shape. Almost like what someone would draw, for instance. If you asked them to draw a Le Mans prototype, this is the essential kind of shape that you would have. At least people who are familiar with older Le Mans, for instance. Now, in practice, it's a slippery car. It burns up its tyres if you give it the chance, especially when it's homologated, because they make it even more powerful. If memory serves, I'm pretty sure it has over 700 horsepower in most scenarios, and this car simply isn't built for that. And that's a huge difference. You take it 4 years later in the sport, and something like an XJR-9 can easily cope with that power. This car simply can't. It starts to get very squirrely and slippery in particular, so it's not that it's slow by any stretch. A 1930s Grand Prix car is not slow, but it still wouldn't stand a chance against a modern car for obvious reasons. Likewise with this one, it feels like much more of a collector's piece, albeit a very, very fast, very powerful in its own way, great sounding and great looking one. In some ways it actually reminds me of the original Mosler, like the Consuliere shape, that simple, raw, just effective design. At the time, it was cool. Nowadays, it just really can't compete against modern cars, as you would hope it wouldn't. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.